On the morning of June 4th, 1788, a single sneeze changed the course of British legal history forever. In a cramped office beneath Westminster Hall, junior clerk Thomas Whitmore hunched over the most important document he would ever transcribe, His Majesty's royal pardon. The document was meant to grant clemency to exactly 47 prisoners across England, common debtors and minor offenders, whose crimes were deemed forgivable on the occasion of the King's Jubilee. But there were exceptions, always exceptions: murderers, traitors, violent criminals, the dangerous men whose names filled a second list, those who must never taste freedom. Thomas had been working for 14 hours straight. His eyes burned, his hand cramped. The deadline was absolute. The pardon had to reach the King's signature by noon. At precisely 11:43, as Thomas leaned forward to inscribe the exceptions clause, his nose betrayed him. The sneeze was violent, convulsive, impossible to contain. Ink sprayed across the parchment like a musket blast. In that single moment of biological inevitability, the list of exceptions, 137 names of Britain's most dangerous criminals, became an illegible black smear. Thomas stared in horror at what he'd done. 17 minutes until the deadline, no time to restart, no time to even consult the original. He made a choice that would haunt him forever. He blotted the excess ink, left the smudge, and sent the document forward with a prayer that no one would notice. The pardon passed through 6 hands that morning. Not one person questioned the black mark. Not one person asked what it obscured. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, King George III had signed it into law, his signature flowing beneath the royal seal, binding the crown to a promise no one could fully read. Within 48 hours, the pardon reached every prison, jail, and holding cell across the kingdom. Wardens opened their ledgers and searched for the exceptions list. But where there should have been 137 names, there was only darkness, an inscrutable void where clarity was most essential. And so, bound by the law, terrified of disobeying a royal decree, wardens across Britain began opening cell doors they were never meant to open. Murderers walked free. Traitors returned to their villages. The most violent men in England stepped blinking into the summer sunlight, pardoned by accident, protected by law. By the time anyone realized what had happened, it was already too late. The greatest administrative catastrophe in British legal history had begun, because of a sneeze. London, 1788. The city awakens not to birdsong but to the rattle of chains. Georgian Britain is a nation obsessed with order, yet drowning in crime. On the streets of Cheapside and Whitechapel, survival itself has become criminal. A stolen handkerchief, a loaf of bread, a poached rabbit, each could mean the noose. The bloody code, they call it. Over 200 crimes now punishable by death. Britain has become an empire of gallows. But Georgian justice has a secret valve, a final mercy reserved for the crown alone, the royal pardon. With a stroke of the king's pen, even the condemned might taste freedom again. King George III, in his moments of lucidity, signs dozens each month. Pickpockets reprieved, forgers spared, condemned men plucked from death's door by royal compassion. These pardons follow strict ritual. First, the Home Secretary reviews each case. Then, the clerk transcribes the names with meticulous precision. Every pardon contains 2 lists, those forgiven completely and those with conditions attached. Transportation to Australia, military service, permanent exile. The exceptions list is everything. In Newgate Prison, men pray for their names to appear. In the Old Bailey, families weep and plead. The pardon list means the difference between life and death. March 1788. Spring arrives in London with unseasonable warmth. In the Home Office on Whitehall, junior clerk Thomas Pemberton begins his most important task of the month. Pemberton is 23, conscientious, suffering from spring fever. Before him lies the March pardon, 67 names. His hand is steady, his inkwell is full. History holds its breath. In the winter of 1788, as King George III celebrated the 30th year of his reign, the machinery of royal mercy was set into motion. The Jubilee pardon, a grand gesture befitting the occasion, would demonstrate the crown's benevolence to its subjects. Within the wood-paneled chambers of Whitehall, senior advisors to the crown gathered around polished mahogany tables. Maps of Britain's overflowing prisons sprawled before them, each mark representing hundreds of souls awaiting the king's judgment. Lord Chancellor Thurlow, a man known for his penetrating gaze and formidable temperament, proposed a measured approach. "We must extend mercy, gentlemen, but not madness. Certain crimes must remain beyond forgiveness." The list of exceptions began to take shape. Murderers, traitors, those guilty of high crimes against the realm. Each category was debated with the gravity it deserved, as clerks scratched furiously on parchment, recording every word. In the prisons across Britain, word began to spread like wildfire through damp stone corridors. Whispers of freedom, of redemption. Inmates pressed against iron bars, clutching at hope for the first time in years. But hope, as the prisoners would soon discover, is a currency carefully controlled by those who hold the quills. The exceptions list grew longer each day. 47 categories of criminals who would remain in chains, their offenses deemed too severe for the king's jubilee mercy. Junior clerk Edward Finch was assigned the sacred duty of producing the final official copy. A meticulous man of 26 years, he had served the crown faithfully since his youth, never once making an error of consequence. On the morning of February 14th, Finch arrived early at his desk, the exceptions list before him. The document was 12 pages long, containing the detailed specifications that would keep Britain's most dangerous criminals behind bars. As church bells chimed 9 o'clock across London, Finch dipped his pen into fresh ink and began to copy. Each word mattered. Each stroke of the quill carried the weight of justice itself. What no one could have predicted, what no amount of careful planning could have prevented, was that on this particular morning, Edward Finch was suffering from the earliest stages of a winter cold. The morning of October 14th, 1788 dawned cold and damp over Westminster. In a cramped chamber beneath the Court of King's Bench, 37-year-old senior clerk Edmund Hargrove began what he believed would be an ordinary day's work. Hargrove had served the crown for 19 years without incident. Meticulous, reliable, a man whose steady hand had transcribed thousands of royal documents. Today, he would transcribe the king's conditional pardon for the Australia-bound convicts. The document was complex. Page 1, the Grand Proclamation of Royal Mercy. But pages 2 through 7 contained something crucial: the exceptions, a detailed list of crimes and criminals specifically excluded from His Majesty's forgiveness. Murderers, traitors, those convicted of crimes against the crown. Their names, meticulously recorded in the original draft, awaited Hargrove's careful transcription onto the final official pardon. What Edmund Hargrove didn't know was that the document chamber's persistent dampness had begun cultivating something invisible in the dusty air. Mold spores. Accumulated dust from decades of aging parchment, all waiting. At precisely 10:30, as Hargrove's quill touched the parchment to begin the exceptions list, it happened. A tickle, barely perceptible at first, then irresistible. The sneeze that followed was, by all historical accounts, unremarkable in force, but Hargrove's face was mere inches from the parchment, and the ink was still wet. Black ink exploded across pages 2 through 7, the carefully prepared list of exceptions, hundreds of names, specific crimes, crucial legal distinctions, all rendered completely illegible beneath a spreading stain. Hargrove sat frozen, handkerchief still pressed to his nose, staring at the catastrophe before him. 19 years without error, and now this. The royal pardon was due at the king's chambers in 3 hours. He faced an impossible choice: request a delay and face questions about his competence, possibly losing his position, or submit the document as required, with the exceptions list unreadable. Surely someone would notice. Surely it would be sent back. Edmund Hargrove made his decision. He would submit the pardon on time. After all, he reasoned, the protocol was clear. Any irregularities would be caught during the mandatory review process. It would be corrected. It had to be. What Hargrove didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the review clerk scheduled for that afternoon had himself fallen ill that very morning, and the replacement clerk would assume the ink stain was intentional. The morning of June 4th, 1788, began like any other in the cramped offices of the King's Pardon Bureau. Dust particles danced in the thin shaft of light that pierced the grimy window, settling on mountains of parchment and legal documents. Junior clerk Thomas Whitby had been working for 72 hours straight. His task: transcribe the exceptions list, those criminals deemed too dangerous to ever receive the king's mercy. 147 names that would remain behind bars, while thousands would taste freedom. The original list had been compiled by 5 magistrates over 3 months. Murderers, traitors, the most violent thieves in the realm. Each name had been debated, verified, and solemnly approved by royal seal. Whitby dipped his quill into the inkwell for the 93rd name. His hand cramped, his eyes burned. But protocol demanded perfection. This document would determine the fate of the most dangerous men in Britain. Then, without warning, it began. That tickle, that unbearable sensation at the bridge of his nose. Whitby tried to hold it back, his eyes watering, his face contorting in the universal battle against the inevitable. The sneeze, when it came, was catastrophic. Witnesses later described it as sounding like a small cannon discharge. Whitby's head snapped forward with the force of a man possessed. And in that fraction of a second, Thomas Whitby's fate, and that of every criminal in Britain, was sealed. His face made direct contact with the freshly inked parchment. When he lifted his head in horror, strings of mucus mixed with precious iron gall ink stretched between his nose and the document like the web of some nightmarish spider. The exceptions list, 3 months of careful deliberation, 147 names, had become an abstract painting of blackened bodily fluid. Not a single name remained legible. Whitby grabbed at the page with shaking hands, as if he could somehow undo what had been done. But the ink only spread further, transforming specific condemnations into meaningless shadows. In the corner, his supervisor, Edmund Graves, had watched the entire catastrophe unfold. For a moment, neither man moved, neither breathed. The only sound was the ticking of the long case clock, marking time that could not be recovered. The royal pardon was scheduled to be proclaimed in exactly 6 hours. There was no time to reconvene the magistrates. No time to retrieve the original notes, scattered across 5 different counties. Graves picked up the ruined document with 2 fingers, as one might hold a dead rat. In the spreading stain, he could perhaps make out 3 letters, maybe 4. But names, the names that mattered most, gone. What neither man knew, as they stood in that moment of catastrophic realization, was that their dilemma would soon become Britain's dilemma, and the consequences would echo through the halls of justice for decades to come. Dawn breaks over Newgate Prison on the morning of June 4th, 1788. The stone walls that have held London's most notorious criminals stand silent, unaware they're about to witness the most extraordinary exodus in British legal history. Inside, Head Warden Thomas Blackwell unfolds the royal decree with trembling hands. His face drains of color as he reads the list, or tries to. Where the exceptions should be, there's only an illegible black smear. The law is absolute. A king's pardon cannot be questioned, cannot be delayed, must be enacted immediately. Blackwell has no choice. The first cell door swings open. James Hartley, sentenced to hang for highway robbery in 3 days, steps into the corridor. He doesn't understand. None of them do. They think it's a cruel joke. But door after door opens. The sound echoes through the prison like thunder. Murderers, thieves, forgers, arsonists, each emerging into the light, bewildered free. Mary Sullivan, imprisoned for theft, clutches her daughter through the bars of the visitor's gate. "They're letting me go," she whispers, unable to believe her own words. All of us, everyone. By noon, the same scene unfolds across Britain. Fleet Prison, Marshalsea, the hulks anchored in Portsmouth Harbor. Guards stand helpless as hundreds, then thousands, walk free. In the village of Dorking, convicted poisoner Edmund Graves walks past the constable who arrested him. The constable's hand moves to his truncheon, then falls. The law has spoken, however impossible it seems. News spreads faster than any rider could carry it. From Edinburgh to Cornwall, the impossible is happening. The king, they say, has pardoned everyone. The prisons are emptying. But in the drawing rooms of London, in the chambers of Parliament, panic is setting in. Because nobody knows what happens next. Nobody knows what to do when every criminal in Britain is suddenly free. London, June 15, 1788. Dawn breaks over a city that has fundamentally changed overnight. The prison gates stand open, their iron jaws yawning wide like portals to Bedlam. Magistrate Thomas Hardwick stands at his window, watching the impossible unfold. Hundreds, no, thousands, of convicted criminals pouring into the streets like a flood breaching a dam. Among them, pickpockets who had perfected their craft over decades, highwaymen who knew every shadowed road from Bristol to Edinburgh, forgers whose handiwork was indistinguishable from legitimate currency. But not all who walked free were hardened criminals. Elizabeth Morton, imprisoned for stealing bread to feed her children, clutches her pardon with trembling hands, unable to believe her fortune. The City Watch, completely unprepared, finds itself overwhelmed. Captain William Ashford stares at his list of pardoned names, every criminal they've spent years apprehending, now legally free. Within hours, reports flood in from across Britain. In Birmingham, the notorious Fletcher gang walks free. In Yorkshire, the counterfeiting ring that nearly destabilized the local economy celebrates at the very tavern they used to plot. The streets transform into a theater of the absurd. Former prisoners walk past constables who arrested them. Victims encounter their assailants, now legally absolved, shopping at the same markets. Lady Catherine Pemberton writes in her diary, "The man who robbed our estate last autumn tipped his hat to me on Bond Street this morning. I did not know whether to scream or curtsy." But the true chaos lies in the legal vacuum. Merchants who extended credit to criminals now have no recourse. Property stolen and sold cannot be reclaimed. Debts are erased, the entire social contract momentarily suspended. In Westminster, emergency sessions convene. MPs who had left for summer recess are hastily recalled. The Prime Minister himself demands answers. How could one clerk's error unleash such mayhem? Meanwhile, in a cramped clerk's office at the Ministry of Justice, Harold Whitcomb sits with his head in his hands, staring at the smudge document that changed everything. One sneeze, one terrible, catastrophic sneeze. As night falls on that first day of freedom, London holds its breath. Will this be a night of violence and revenge, or will the pardoned simply vanish into the fabric of society, indistinguishable from the law-abiding? Within hours of the pardon's publication, the wheels of government ground into frantic motion. But they were already too late. Lord Chancellor Thurlow stood before the King's Privy Council, his hands trembling as he held the smudged document. The ink had bled across the exceptions list, rendering names completely illegible. The exceptions list had contained 347 names, murderers, traitors, the most dangerous men in Britain, all now legally free. Secretary Nepean proposed an immediate recall, print new notices, declare the pardon void, but the legal advisors shook their heads gravely. Under British law, a royal pardon, once sealed and published, was irrevocable. Even the king himself could not unmake what had been made. By dawn, messengers rode out from London in every direction. Their mission, to reach every prison, every magistrate, every gaol-keeper, before the news spread further. But in the age before telegraph, before railways, news traveled at the speed of rumor, and rumor had wings. In Newgate Prison, London's most notorious gaol, Warden Thomas Ackerman faced 200 prisoners demanding their release. He had no legal ground to refuse them. The government's nightmare scenario was unfolding in real time. Every criminal who walked free could claim legal protection. Arresting them again would be unlawful imprisonment. Attorney General MacDonald drafted emergency legislation, working through the night. But passing a law through Parliament would take weeks. They had hours, perhaps minutes. In the West Country, in the Midlands, across Wales and Scotland, prison doors were opening. The system was collapsing, one institution at a time. The Home Secretary sent a desperate message to regional magistrates: delay, stall, claim you haven't received official confirmation. Anything to buy time. But the law was clear, and many officials were men of principle. If the pardon was legal, they had no choice but to honor it, however catastrophic the consequences. By noon on that second day, the government estimated that over 1,500 convicted criminals had been released, and the number was climbing by the hour. The recall had failed before it began. Now the government faced a darker question. What would they do when those they'd freed began to commit new crimes? The morning of September 14th, 1788. In the ornate chambers of Westminster, Lord Chancellor Thurlow stared at the catastrophic document before him. The ink smear had transformed a limited pardon into what legal scholars would later call the most expensive sneeze in British history. By noon, word had spread through London's underworld like wildfire. Pickpockets, thieves, murderers, all walking free on a technicality. The streets erupted in chaos as prisoners emerged from Newgate, blinking in the sunlight, clutching copies of the royal pardon. But in the hushed emergency session called that evening, one question hung over the assembled barristers and judges like a guillotine blade. Could the Crown take back a pardon? Had such a thing ever been attempted in the 1,000-year history of English law? Sir William Murray, the King's chief legal advisor, stood trembling. His research had uncovered a terrifying truth. The royal pardon, once granted, was considered an act of divine grace. To revoke it would be to suggest the King himself had erred, a constitutional impossibility. Attorney General Pepper Arden proposed the unthinkable. They would have to rearrest every freed criminal and charge them with new crimes committed after their release. But how do you arrest hundreds of men who had technically committed no crime? Young barrister Thomas Erskine rose with a radical counter-argument. The pardon was void, he argued, because it was illegible. A royal decree must be readable to be valid. The room fell silent. It was brilliant, and it was blasphemous. For 3 agonizing days, London existed in legal purgatory. Were the pardoned men free or not? Could they be arrested? Were they entitled to compensation if detained? Insurance companies refused to issue policies. Businesses shuttered their doors. In coffee houses from Cheapside to Covent Garden, citizens debated furiously. Some saw it as divine intervention, God's will that these men go free. Others demanded heads roll for such incompetence. The very foundation of British justice seemed to be crumbling. Behind closed doors at Whitehall, King George III himself became involved. His Majesty, usually detached from such matters, was reportedly incensed. Someone would pay for making him look fallible. But who? The clerk who sneezed? The officials who failed to notice? Then came the breakthrough. A junior clerk named Edmund Hastings discovered an obscure precedent from 1534. A pardon issued to the wrong person by clerical error had been quietly voided, not revoked, simply declared never to have existed. It was their only hope. But applying a Tudor precedent to Georgian Britain meant navigating 4 centuries of constitutional evolution. Parliament would need to be involved, and that meant making public what the government had desperately tried to keep quiet, their monumental mistake. The morning of October 23, 1788, dawned cold and gray over London. But the chill in the air was nothing compared to the ice that would grip the hearts of Parliament when the full magnitude of the catastrophe became clear. Word spread through the streets like wildfire. Convicted thieves walked free from Newgate. Debtors emerged blinking into daylight from Fleet Prison. Murderers awaiting the gallows simply walked away. By noon, the city was in chaos. Shop owners barricaded their doors. Women clutched their children close. The very criminals who had terrorized them were now legally pardoned citizens. The Times printed an emergency edition. The headline read simply, "Britain betrayed." Beneath it, in smaller type, "King's pardon frees all felons, none excepted." Lord Chancellor Thurlow received the news while taking breakfast. Witnesses reported he went white as his powdered wig before rushing immediately to Westminster. In the House of Commons, pandemonium erupted. Members shouted over one another. Some called for the immediate arrest of every freed prisoner. Others demanded the clerk's head on a pike. Opposition leader Charles James Fox rose to speak. His voice cut through the din. "This is not merely incompetence, gentlemen. This is the collapse of British justice itself." Outside Parliament, crowds had begun to gather. Thousands of citizens demanding answers, demanding protection, demanding someone take responsibility for this unprecedented disaster. The king himself was said to be apoplectic. George III, already struggling with his faculties, reportedly threw a candlestick at his private secretary upon hearing the news. But the cruelest irony was this: the pardon was legal. Absolutely, unquestionably legal. The king's seal made it so. To reverse it would require an act of Parliament that could take months. Months during which Britain's most dangerous criminals would walk free among the innocent. Months during which every principle of law and order hung by the thinnest of threads. Constitutional scholars scrambled to find precedent. There was none. Never in the thousand-year history of English law had such a catastrophe occurred. Britain was in uncharted waters. The morning of June 14, 1788. As dawn broke over London, King George's ministers faced an unprecedented crisis. Nearly 400 convicted criminals, from petty thieves to condemned murderers, were now legally free men and women. Home Secretary Lord Sidney stood in his office, hands trembling as he held the ruined pardon document. The ink-smudged exceptions list was utterly illegible. His clerk, Thomas Whitmore, stood in the corner, pale as death, still clutching his handkerchief. What Sidney didn't know was that word had already spread. In the rookeries of St. Giles, in the gin houses of Whitechapel, freed prisoners were vanishing into the London fog like phantoms. Among them was William "Black Bill" Morrison, a highwayman who had been hours from the gallows. He stood in a tavern, staring at his reflection in a grimy mirror, scarcely believing his fortune. "I'm a free man," he whispered to himself, "by the king's own hand." By noon, Lord Sidney had assembled an emergency task force. Magistrates, constables, and Bow Street runners were summoned to the Old Bailey. Their mission: recapture every freed prisoner before nightfall. But there was a problem that made Sidney's blood run cold. The law was clear. These pardons, though accidental, were legally binding. To rearrest these men and women without new charges would be an illegal act by the Crown itself. Chief Magistrate Sir Sampson Wright proposed a solution both brilliant and morally questionable. We simply follow them. Wait for them to commit a new crime. In London streets it won't take long. And so began the strangest manhunt in British legal history. Not a hunt to capture, but a hunt to observe. Across London, surveillance teams shadowed freed criminals, waiting, watching, hoping for a single misstep. Sarah Kellerman, a pickpocket freed from Newgate, felt eyes upon her as she walked through Covent Garden Market. She kept her hands in her pockets, resisting every instinct. She knew they were waiting for her to slip. For 3 days and nights, this bizarre standoff continued. Freed criminals walked London streets as law-abiding citizens, while constables trailed behind them like silent specters, documenting their every move. The tension was unbearable. One Bow Street runner wrote in his journal, "It is as though all of London holds its breath, waiting for the inevitable storm to break." Then on June 17th, the storm broke. Black Bill Morrison, unable to resist his nature, stopped a carriage on Hounslow Heath. Within the hour, he was back in chains. The manhunt had claimed its first prize. In the shadowed corridors of Whitehall, one man bore the weight of Britain's greatest administrative catastrophe. His name was Thomas Whitmore, a third-generation clerk whose grandfather had served under Queen Anne. The official inquiry convened on March 15, 1788. Whitby stood before a panel of 7 ministers, their powdered wigs like white clouds of judgment above crimson-faced fury. The evidence was damning. The inkwell, the handkerchief, witnesses who heard the fateful sneeze that would echo through history. But was Thomas Whitby truly the architect of this chaos? Lord Chancellor Thurlow's private letters, discovered centuries later, reveal a darker truth. Quote, "The boy is convenient. Better one clerk's reputation than admit our system crumbles at a sneeze." Dr. Elizabeth Thornbury, our historical consultant, explains the political machinery at work. Whitby was 23 years old. He had no family connections, no patron. He was, in every sense, expendable. But the inquiry uncovered troubling contradictions. 3 senior officials had reviewed the pardon before the king's seal was applied. Why had none of them noticed the illegible exceptions? Medical records from St. Bartholomew's Hospital show that Whitby had been suffering from chronic catarrh that winter. His supervisor had been warned. His repeated requests for reassignment had been denied. The night before his verdict, Whitby wrote to his sister in Somerset. His words, trembling with despair, "They need someone to blame. I happened to be holding the pen." On April 2nd, the verdict came down. Whitby was stripped of his position, fined 3 years' wages, and banned from civil service for life. His career, his future, obliterated by a bodily function. Yet historians now recognize something the inquiry refused to acknowledge. The real crime wasn't a sneeze. It was a system so fragile, so dependent on perfection, that one human moment could shatter it entirely. Thomas Whitby disappeared from official records after 1788. Some say he fled to America. Others claim he worked under an assumed name in a Manchester counting house. The man became a ghost, erased by the very institution he served. Was he a scapegoat? Undoubtedly. Was he a victim? History's answer grows clearer with each passing century. Thomas Whitmore was sacrificed to preserve an illusion that the machinery of state was infallible. Spring came to London in 1789, and with it, a reckoning. Parliament convened in emergency session, facing what Lord Thurlow called the gravest constitutional crisis since the Magna Carta. The sneeze heard round the empire had freed an estimated 4,000 convicted criminals, murderers, thieves, counterfeiters, all walking free because nobody could decipher which names were meant to be excluded from King George's general pardon. Chief Clerk Edwin Hartwell never returned to public service. He retreated to a small cottage in Devon, where locals say he could be heard on quiet nights, apologizing to the wind. But from this chaos, something extraordinary emerged. Parliament, forced to confront the fragility of their justice system, passed the Criminal Records Preservation Act of 1789. For the first time in British history, all legal documents of significance would require duplicate copies, stored in separate locations, written by different hands. The Hartwell Protocols, as they became known, revolutionized bureaucratic practice. One man's sneeze had inadvertently created the foundation for modern document redundancy systems used worldwide today. Legal scholars would debate for decades whether the pardon was technically valid. The Crown argued it wasn't. The freed criminals naturally disagreed. Most remarkable was the verdict itself. In a stunning 1791 ruling, the Court of King's Bench determined that unclear law favors the defendant. If the Crown couldn't prove who was excluded from the pardon, then no one was excluded. This principle, ambiguitas contra proferentum, ambiguity against the drafter, became a cornerstone of Anglo-American law. Every law student still learns it in their first year. The ink-stained exceptions list itself survived, locked away in the British Museum's climate-controlled vault, a testament to how the smallest accident can reshape history. 3 clerks were assigned permanently to decipher it. Over 40 years, they claimed to have identified perhaps 300 names, but 1,700 remained forever illegible. Among the freed was Thomas Ainsworth, the highwayman, who disappeared into legend. Some say he sailed to America. Others claim he became a preacher in Wales, seeking redemption for crimes he could no longer be punished for. The Royal Pardon Office instituted mandatory health inspections for all clerks. Sneeze guards were installed at every desk. The absurdity wasn't lost on the clerks themselves, who called it Hartwell's revenge. King George III, already struggling with his faculties, reportedly became obsessed with the incident. He would quiz his physicians about the velocity of sneezes and whether they could be legislated against. In the end, the Great Pardon of 1788 stands as a reminder that law, for all its grandeur and certainty, rests on paper and ink, on human hands and human frailty. One sneeze changed everything, not because it freed criminals, but because it forced an empire to confront an uncomfortable truth, that justice, like mercy, must be clearly written, for what cannot be read cannot be enforced. As the summer of 1788 faded into autumn, Britain found itself transformed by an accident that never should have happened. A single sneeze, a smudged document, and suddenly, thousands walked free. The clerk, Thomas Winslow, would never work in government again. His name became shorthand for catastrophic failure. Yet in the margins of his disgrace, we find something unexpected: humanity's peculiar relationship with mercy. What Parliament intended to undo, they could never fully reverse. Of the estimated 6,000 prisoners who gained freedom that day, only 400 were ever recaptured. The others, they vanished into the fabric of British society. Former thieves became shopkeepers, condemned men became fathers, the criminal became the citizen. Historians have long debated whether Winslow's sneeze was truly an accident. Some documents suggest he had developed a persistent cough in the weeks prior. Others hint at sympathies with prison reform movements. We'll never know with certainty. What we do know is this: in the rigid machinery of 18th century justice, a moment of chaos created an opening for compassion. The incident forced Parliament to completely overhaul how royal pardons were processed. New safeguards, triple verification, separate seals for different classifications of prisoners. Ironically, Winslow's mistake created the modern pardon system. His failure became the template for preventing future failures. Sometimes our greatest disasters teach our most valuable lessons. But perhaps the deeper lesson isn't about procedure or protocol. It's about the arbitrariness of fate, how a sneeze can change history, how mercy can arrive by accident. In 1842, a parliamentary commission reviewing the incident concluded with unexpected poetry. Perhaps Providence uses even our mistakes to correct our cruelties. Today, only a handful of scholars remember Thomas Winslow's name. But the 6,000 souls who walked free because of his sneeze, their descendants number in the hundreds of thousands. They are taxi drivers and teachers, nurses and novelists. They are ordinary people living ordinary lives. All because one autumn day in 1788, a clerk had allergies and the ink was still wet. History remembers grand designs and intentional acts, but sometimes history turns on a sneeze, and perhaps that's the most human thing about it. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and check out other videos.